My name is Terry Gallagher, and I'm the Education Director. This is the 2023 Follow the River Lecture Series, our first in-person lecture since 2019, because 2020 we went virtual. And so we welcome you back to the museum. Um, Behind me is Mike Porio. He is the education coordinator and the Solaris, our solar-powered boat. He also is the coordinator for the programming on the Solaris. And I will get to our guest speaker in one moment. Before we begin, I just want to ask if you can please turn off your cell phones. And if you are watching, and thank you for accommodating the change in location that we made last minute. We did sustain some flooding in our wooden boat school. So we're in cleanup efforts over there, and we should be back over there by the end of next week. We also thank you for your contributions to the museum, either through your membership or through paying an admission to the lecture series. The museum is a 501(c)(3), C3, not-for-profit. We don't receive any city, county, state, or federal money except for some grants, periodic project-based grants. We thank Rondout Savings Bank for their sponsorship of the lecture series, and we thank you again for your contributions. We also would like to take this moment to recognize that the Maritime Museum is located on the Rondout Creek, part of the Lenape-Hoking traditional home of the Lenape tribes. And currently we recognize our occupation of this land, and we are collaborating with present-day Lenape communities to improve our programming and exhibits and public programs to address the occupation of the land. Our next lecture is a hybrid virtual and in person, and that's Wednesday, February 8th. So this lecture series will be the second Wednesday of every month through the end of 2023. And that lecture in February is with Daniel Levy, who is the author of Manhattan Phoenix, which is a book written about the 1835 fire in New York City and the resurrection, or how the rebuilding of Manhattan started after that fire. This evening, our lecture is Stories of Marginalized Workers on the D&H Canal with Bill Merchant. Bill is the Deputy Director for Collections, the historian and curator at the D&H Canal Historical Society, or for the D&H Canal Historical Society. He's the chair of the D&H Transportation Heritage Council and secretary and chair of the collections at the Century House Historical Society. He chairs the Marbletown Historic Preservation Commission and is on the Marbletown Community Preservation Advisory Board. He is currently writing an updated history of the D&H Canal and researching for a book on the history of Rosendale cement. He also has a long career as a double bass luthier, which I had to Google. We're glad you're with us tonight, and you're a very good friend of the museum, and I've heard wonderful things about you, and mostly about the information that you know. So we're excited to have you here, and I turn the lecture over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be here at the Maritime Museum. So will I see the slides on that side? Okay, good. Otherwise, I'll get confused where I am. Is it? Yeah, I think it's doing pretty good. Can anybody out there? Are you out there? Where? I'm on the radio in Kingston, and it's always wonderful when people say, "I hear you on the radio," because you have no idea. It's 7:30 in the morning, and you're talking to one other. It's like talking to yourself. But I spent a lot of the COVID talking to myself, doing video work, walking around, going, "Oh, and that was." So thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful always to be here at the Maritime Museum. We really, our stories intertwine. The D&H Canal would be nothing without the Hudson River. And so our stories really intersect here. I'm honored to be one of the speakers on the Solaris. If you haven't gone, you don't have to go for me. You just have to go because it's a great boat and it's a great a tour to be on. But they've got a lot of great programming on it as well. I do one where we start right here, obviously, and go all the way to the dam and back. And I talk about all the industrial activity that was really fostered by the D&H Canal, kind of made the town a round out. But tonight we're going to talk about the marginalized workers on the D&H Canal. And at this point, I want to point out that and I have to read this right because I'm legally obliged. This was made possible by a grant from the Ulster County Community Grants Fund of the Community Foundations of the Hudson Valley. And I have to talk to them. Can't they make that just the community foundations? But God bless them. They gave me a stipend back in 2019 to do some research on the marginalized populations. And, it's the kind of work that as a historian I would be doing anyways. But by giving me a stipend, I felt I needed to have a product, right? So instead of just informing my story, it really informed our new museum in High Falls. I've written, I'll plug it at the end of this talk, and I've done 4 or 5 different presentations. In fact, I'll be doing women on the D&H Canal. I get to the girls last. That's going to be a tough one, though, as we'll see as we go along here. And like you, we also all like to recognize that we are in the homeland of the Munsee and Lenape people, that this was, in fact, a huge civilization that was here before Columbus that we pretty well wiped out, and we do what little we can. I'm afraid, but at least we try and do something. So very often when I talk about the D&H Canal, I talk about these guys. You notice a pattern: bunch of white men. So I'm not going to talk about any of them today, but these are some fascinating guys in and of themselves. But here's the D&H Canal. I don't know how much you folks know about it. It was 3/4 of all the world's anthracite coal is in northeastern Pennsylvania. And I only learned that a couple years ago. Astounding statistic. And the D&H was one of, I believe it was 8 canals that were built mainly to exploit that resource. The D&H Canal ran from Honesdale, right there. Did I turn it off? Ran from Honesdale, I don't need the pointer, ran along the Lackawaxen River, 108 miles, 108 locks. It's still 80 miles from its market in New York City. But this was, topography is king. You've got the Shawangunk Mountains here. This was the way to go. I'm doing some research right now, and they seriously considered, the town fathers here in Newburgh, everybody wanted the canal to end there. They seriously considered tunneling the Shawangunk Mountains. That doesn't happen until one of the railroads do it in the 1870s. I would doubt that they had the ability. But on the other hand, Thomas Jefferson, when they posited the Erie Canal, thought it would be folly. He's like, it's going to be 100 years before we can do that. I love Thomas Jefferson, but there's a man with a lot of cognitive dissonance. See, that's a whole talk I could give too. But here's the thing: marginalized people built and operated the D&H Canal, and because of the research I've done, I can say that definitively. And what do I marginalize? I'm talking about immigrants, people of color, women and children, the people that history ignores. And so how do I, as a historian, they're marginalized, so they're not being written about. I've been very fortunate. These are my main sources. Newspaper accounts, and I call out Dorothy Sanderson because she, in the middle of the 20th century, did copious amounts of research with microfilm and the like, I assume. Her book is the best of the secondary sources. Lowenthal is good too, but she's really well footnoted, and it's a lot of period newspapers. Primary sources, if you don't know what they are, sources, stuff that people wrote at the time. And then we've got John Willard Johnston, and I'll quote John a few times because he was a guy, as a kid, the surveyors surveying the line of the D&H Canal along the Delaware River camp on his family's property. He and his playmates, they play surveyor on the strength of it, He becomes a surveyor and then a lawyer because of that. Surveyors very often in early American history ended up going into court a lot. They became lawyers. He becomes a widower, he retires, and he writes his reminiscence. And because he's a man of a certain age, he doesn't pull any punches. You know exactly how he feels about everybody. It's a great read. You can get that book from the Minisink Valley Historical Society. They publish it. But the other thing is the court testimony. There's a huge court case, the Pennsylvania Coal Company versus the D&H Canal Company. It was some 5,000 pages of testimony. A lot of it pretty boring, but there's some great stories. And so I'm very fortunate with mainly these sources, the stories that you'll hear today, I'm able to say definitively the things that I say. This is a great map, reminds me of that one over there on the wall. That's why it's better to be in person, folks. You know, I'm pointing to stuff in the room. This is an early map that was used to get. This is the first $1 million private enterprise in American history, and this is a map that they had produced in 1824, really as a tool to get people behind it. They sold out once they proved you could burn anthracite coal. 108-mile long canal. It's oft quoted that in 1825, just from here to Cutterbackville, we're talking about Cutterbackville, 2,500 men and 200 teams of horses and draft animals were employed. An immense undertaking. These people made $12 to $14 a month. So it was well known, Irishmen, for who else would dig and delve and drudge and do domestic work and make canals and roads and execute great lines of internal improvement? Irishmen. This is Charles Dickens after he's toured America. But this is well known. The Irish did a lot of manual labor. At this point, I want to point out the Irish at this point in history were vilified. They were Catholic, which was somehow made them not Christian. I still scratch my head on that one. They were basically just a step above enslaved people. And as such, they were vilified. People today might not appreciate it, but where in the middle of the 20th century you have white and black play, in the 19th century, Irish need not apply. They were considered second-class citizens. Enslavers actually in the South would employ the Irish on jobs that had a high mortality rate so that they wouldn't lose their chattel. Sad but true. So Irishmen were really integral. And here John tells us, John Willard Johnson, every contractor employed from necessity a large number of laborers, mostly and in most cases wholly of Irish nationality. And through all my research, I can find, for instance, no indication of black labor in the construction of the canal. But it's well documented the Irish would fight even with other Irish to keep that work. And so the Irish were integral. It couldn't have been built without the low-cost labor that these immigrants, we are a nation of immigrants. These people came for the reason, like they still do today. Immigrants are nothing but a net positive, folks. The late Dr. A.J. Williams Myers writes that the economic boom, canal fever, 19th century America had canal fever. All of a sudden, we didn't have real good transportation infrastructure. We didn't have Roman roads. We didn't have ways, they took Native American trails. They were often muddy. It was actually better to ship in the winter when the ground was frozen. You could use sleds. We didn't have infrastructure. Canals in the earliest part, as railroads ascended, were a way for the most efficacious way for this young country to create transportation infrastructure. Over 2,000 miles of canals were built in like the first, I think, 20 years, say between 1820. We started building about 1800, but really it takes off with the Erie Canal, opens in 1825, and the D&H right on the tails of it. But as railroads ascend, canals really answer the problem of how to get places. Dr. A.J. Williams Myers talks about, he's a scholar of people of color, the economic boom involved the rail and canal systems, an economic boom from which the Irish would benefit, but there would be no benefits for African Americans. I can say that's true as regards the construction. I'm sure there must have been a few of them employed, but for the most part, the Irish fought for that work, and this is well documented on many other projects, not just the D&H Canal. But I disagree with them, as we'll see a little further down the line here. And by the way, if anybody has questions, feel free. I don't know that if there'll be chat questions, but I'll take questions at the end. But if anybody has questions here, feel free to raise your hand. And we're a nice, small, intimate group, and we might as well. We're all friends here now. Just a wonderful period. So this is what they built. This is Ellenville, New York. That lock is now either under the road or gone. But after the canal was constructed, they needed to operate it. Again, Johnston tells us, the mass were composed of the vulgar and debased, of ages from 10 to 60, of the various kinds, classes, and nationalities, Irish, Dutch, Africans, Americans, and others, all of the most lewd, vulgar, and depraved, and honesty compels the admission the most objectionable features were found amongst the Americans. You find quotes that you just really love, the Dickens one, this one, And by the way, when he says Dutch, I know of one Dutchman who worked on the canal. There were probably a few. He's referring to Deutsch, Germans. One source says that the canal was basically built by Irish labor and German masons, stonemasons. More often than not, they're referring to Germans. And certainly I'm sure that's what Mr. Johnston meant. And this is right here. Wow, this could just be down the road a little ways from here. This is In fact, it's probably Island Dock, so it's probably, yeah, right over there. You know. We have a lot. I've got 8,000 images on my computer. I was just going through them, and some of them are repeats, but I have a lot of great period images, and a lot of them you'll see a lot of them in this room. There's a lot of great D&H. So here's a data point. It's 1882, but still valid. The first boatload of coal down the Delaware and Hudson Canal was unloaded by 3 men, each named John, under a foreman also by that name. So the ubiquity of the name John in 1825, right? 1828, this would have been. The loafers were Irish, German, and African descent. The foreman was American. So from the start, you've got this mixed. You've got a German, you've got a black man, and you've got an Irishman. And by the way, a loafer was a term, very specific term. It was the people that waited here to unload the coal from the boats. And I've got a great, I found this at the Century House Historical Society. I don't know where this came from, but I think it's a 19th century, this is, the Century House has got a ton of stuff, none of it cataloged. I've got my life's work between the canal and the Century House. But this little piece over here says, the coal shovelers worked in gangs of 3 men to a boat, and shoveled coal into the buckets, transferring cargoes from canal boats. Probably due to broken time awaiting assignments, they acquired the occupational name of loafers. In busy times, 50 to 60 gangs of loafers were employed. And so once again, these were jobs, even at this point in time, that the lowest strata of society took, that it was people of color, it was the Irish. Almost entirely, this level job, the management jobs went to other people. You gotta have a little color. E.L. Henry painted some great, this is also probably Ellenville. E.L. Henry was one of the founding members of the Cragsmore Arts Colony and had a summer home above it. So he has in fact, there's a very famous, it's not in this talk, but there's a very famous scene of a packet boat on a canal that PBS put in a special on the Erie Canal. And so whenever I put it up on social media, people go, oh, no, that's the Erie. I can tell you definitively from the catalog resume, it's Ellenville. His wife tells us. So it's not even my speculation in saying, but yeah, it's nice to have a little color in the talk too. So, and so here the Delaware and Hudson Canal in prosperous times it employs nearly 2,000 boatmen. They're chiefly foreigners and men who follow the canal for life. So this becomes a way for people. This becomes a living. This becomes what you do, and it's an interesting way of life because you're on a boat. The boats were owned by you were buying them from the canal company. Sometimes there were people, as we'll see later in the talk, there were people that would buy boats and hire crews. But a lot of times people would buy it in a latter period, as the price went down, families would live on them. This became, your life from April to December. Our winters were more severe. None of this rain in January stuff, although I like it. So the canal shut right down. You could say that the canal was almost doomed from the start, because you needed the coal in the winter and you couldn't move it. You had to get all your coal in before it froze in. And this is in 1878, but I can tell you 2,000 boatmen. At its peak, the D&H Canal Company operated 1,000 boats, and they were supposed to have 3-person crews. So you had 3,000 people living on those boats, and then maybe another 300 to 400 boats for the other industries that also used the canal and paid tolls, unlike the coal boats. The D&H Canal Company was a coal company. So really, those numbers were closer to at the peak, 5,000 and 6,000 people living on this 108-mile-long ditch. There were groceries almost at each lock, and for the most part, they were fair. John Johnson's got a few stories about some people that gouged you, but for the most part, there wasn't a company store. There was some shenanigans, but that's kind of natural. So this is in the latter period. So this is actually when railroads are now starting to ascend, and there's less traffic on the canal. The canal company itself, they knew all about their labor force. So Russell Farnham Lord, we're fortunate enough to have his correspondence journal. Russell Farnham Lord was the 3rd chief engineer of the D&H Canal. Started as the chief engineer when John Jervis resigned in 1830, and he works until 1862. He steps down. At that point, he's an alcoholic. But the company, he works for the company until he dies in, I think it's 67 or 68. But we have his correspondence journals. In fact, the first presentation I ever did for the Maritime Museum was after we got these journals, and I did a presentation on a lot of great stuff I learned from his journals. And they're only from 3 or 4 years. I've got to look. Minisink Valley's got a lot of his writing. I'm planning to go down and look through all his letters. But here he's writing about they're enlarging the canal. In 1850, they undertake their major enlargement. They make everything bigger. The boats all get bigger. All the locks, 108 locks are rebuilt. All the aqueducts have to be rebuilt. Everything is rebuilt. They had enlarged in the 1840s, but they just made it deeper. And that cost some money, but that was nothing like this final enlargement. But they had made a deal with the PA Coal Company, which then leads to litigation. So here, Russell Farnham Lord, he's looking for workers. This work was done in the winter when the canal was closed down. So he knows, he says, we're going to have plenty of people from Roundout here down to, Wurtsboro, and we're good from Honesdale. So the canal has come through. This was all wilderness, but now it's prosperous. And so there's lots of people, but there's still that stretch between Pond Eddy and Wurtsboro, and they're going to advertise in the New York papers. And so he's writing to Isaac Newton Seymour, the treasurer at the time. But he says, we should get them an equal proportion of Irish and German because they're better controlled that way. So not only did he know what his workforce was, he knew how to work with it. And again, here's a data point, even in 1850, who are they getting to do the work? These are immigrants. In fact, by 1855, more than half the population of this town, Rondout, was immigrants. I think it was 55%, but I might be confusing my numbers. And that was people that were brought here to work on the canal, and then the many industries, and I'll touch a little bit on that. And this is actually from the county map of, that's, I think, 1854 county map. So really, Roundout was built on the back of the D&H Canal and the industries that then were fostered by it. But this town was more than half. So that's why we got all these churches. You had at least one Irish. I think there were multiple Irish Catholic churches. There were German Catholic churches. Roundout is a town of churches. But it was all these different groups that really made Roundout. Roundout by 1872 is a larger village than Kingston when they're joined. Roundout, because of the canal, becomes a bigger town than Kingston. I don't want to say it made Kingston because Kingston's got a lot, but and they also had to go as they started mining deeper and deeper into the earth. We didn't have the knowledge. They hired many. They would put ads in the papers in the United Kingdom. They hired Irish, Scotch, and Welsh miners, and these guys knew how to dig coal deep down in the earth. To this day, the town of Carbondale, where the D&H mines were, has many, many descendants of the Welsh that moved there to do the mining. So again, they couldn't get people here. So there were jobs in America from the start that we're not even Native American. Well, I'm part Seneca, so actually, this land is I'm only a 32nd, but I'm immensely proud of that 32nd, right? But really, as you started at the beginning, we were interlopers as well, but we quickly got an attitude. And so jobs were beneath, to this day, who's going to take in your crops? 80% of all the restaurant workers in Manhattan 10 years ago, and I'm sure it's still true, are from 2 towns in Oaxaca. They're taking jobs that people don't want. You look at agriculture. The crops, if we didn't have people coming over from Mexico, from other places, the crops would not get in. These jobs are beneath us. We right now have how many people, because of COVID, lots of people, we don't have to work. We've got it very easy in America, is my point. And that's just, I love this image. The first time I saw this, I said, this has to be Carbondale. This is Honesdale. This is at the start of navigation. They had a gravity railroad that went up over 850 foot of the Moosic Mountains that took the coal from their mines to the start of navigation. And that could operate almost year-round. So especially in the spring, you'd all of a sudden have an awful lot of coal. I also love how they work smart, chutes to load the cars. And some of these cars actually could just be pulled up to the boat and just dump the coal into the boats. This was a very innovative company that, despite relying on marginalized people for its labor force, embraced new technologies at every turn, as I touched on the talk I did for the Desmond Center. It's hard to tell the nationality of people in pictures, right? People of color, you'll see every picture of a black worker I've got, because we don't got many. The great Manville Wakefield, a founding member of our museum and wrote Coal Boats to Tidewater, he tells us that gentleman right there is no doubt a son of Aaron. But in fact, probably most of the workforce, to a large degree, were the Irish that came and took these jobs. But it's the one picture I can go, oh, Irishman. Well, according to Manville, of course. And of course, though it was a coal company, there was many, many other industries. I mean, that's just all wood products, isn't it? There, the other kinds of things they had to do. People had to build boats. I've got the names of over 100 boat makers and boat concerns. The boats only lasted 5 to 10 years, and they costed in the earliest period $400 or $500. By the mid period, it was between $800 and $1,400, and you bought it from the company. The boats were numbered. When they got a name, it meant you had paid it off, and if you took good care of your boat, you might get a few years. Every trip they took in the mid period about $20. So you're getting 130 tons of coal on the boat. You were getting $1 a ton at its peak. So each load you did, you got $130 credited to you. 20 went to pay for your boat, and then you might do, 14, 16 trips. Do the math. But you had to pay for tack. You had to pay for your food. You had to pay your help. So boat building, there were. I haven't memorized how many dry docks. This is a dry dock you can visit. This is at the Bova Road facility in the northern part of Sullivan County. It's a public park. They've got you can see the dry dock itself or what's left of it, and Lock 50. It's a great little site. And they needed lock tenders. You had 108 locks, and until 1853, you needed 2, one on each side, to man the miter gates. These are miter gates here, invented by Leonardo da Vinci in 1500. And as I love this, it's like an arch, right? If you made your miter, your locks like this, they wouldn't last, right? But by making it like this, the water pressure holds the lock doors tight. But early on, you had to have a guy on each side to move each side. The canal company instituted a semi-patented scheme between 1853 and 57 and converted all 108 locks. But they were paying lock tenders $30 to $40 a month. So, do the math. You can lay off or repurpose 108 workers. Again, this is a company that, despite its reliance on low-cost labor, also used technology at every turn. Natural cement was discovered by a geologist hired by the D&H Canal Company. The Rosendale cement industry owes itself to the D&H Canal. It was a means for it to move the product, but they actually discovered it, and it becomes a huge industry. And so, once again, you've got, 4,000 or 5,000 people on the boats. How many thousands working the cement? There were 40 cement concerns in Ulster County in the period. More than half of North America's cement was Rosendale cement in the second half of the 19th century. Huge industry. And again, largely the Quarry Irish and Bluestone. And speaking of the Quarry Irish, it's well documented that the Bluestone workers were largely Irishmen as well. And we all probably know Fitch's. This is great. This is see on the Solaris boat tour. We go and you can still. That's the what's the name of it? It's one of the earliest Portland cement factories, 1863. All that's left now is the smokestack. There's the bridge that's still there. That's an ice house. There were 6 or 8 or 10 ice houses all along the round out. There was 6 of them in a row on the which end would that be? On the far end of Island Dock. Back in they're all gone now. Where the parks and stuff are, that nice flat land. But a great photo. But I, as that earlier newspaper account said, one of the first people unloading coal was a black man. And here we have a newspaper account. This is 1877, and they talk about Brother King, the well-known and universally respected colored man who has worked on the dock almost since the canal was discovered. So a few things. First, the canal was discovered. But clearly, Brother King, must have spent his whole life working on the D&H Canal. And again, that was typical. This was the job, and it was in some ways, it was in particular, if you were the contractor and buying your own boat, you were the captain of your ship. It was you had some agency, and in fact, as we see, oops, that's 3 slides ahead. Here's one of the few images we have of a person of color. We'll get a little closer there. Now, I don't know the stories, photography being what it is, you don't know. Are these kids mule drivers? Very possibly. Generally speaking, not kids, but a single child. But there were men who were mule drivers. Presumably, this man worked either on that boat. We just don't know. But I don't have that many images. I was talking to somebody at the Canal Society in New York about 10 years ago, discussing images of people of color. They had an intern looking through all the Erie Canal. They can't find one. I'm lucky. I've got, well, you'll see them all, which is a shame. And again, we sort of talked about it. And we said, yeah, so you got out the camera. It's new tech. the person of color, they'd move them out of the screen, wouldn't they? But that's, this is what makes it hard to tell these stories. Once again, here we are in Rondout. This is Jim Jackson, a shoveler, what we might also call a loafer. I'm told that Jim's family is still extant, and I've got to reach out to them. I'd love to learn more about the man, because Jim is the only black D&H Canal worker where we have his image and his name. So that other image I showed you, I don't know who that guy is. But for whatever reasons, this is probably the 1890s, the latter period. So maybe people are getting a little better about these things. But we know that Jim was a shoveler or loafer. This is the only instance I found of them being referred to as shovelers, for that matter. That picture has probably been taken. We have a bunch of them that are similar. Louis Hoysrath, who worked in the D&H offices here in Rondout, we have some images. He was an amateur photographer, so we have images, original prints of his, with his signature on the back. I know that he took them, and we know. So now this image on the left, it was actually a stereo. Someday I'm just going to do a presentation on postcard images and stereoscopes. It amazes me what they made postcards and stereoscopes of. This is a stereoscope image I had the slide of it, but it was redundant. It's hard to say, but I'm pretty sure that this whole crew is a black crew. Now you get into the sort of, well, I think so. Is it just bad lighting? But this slide to tell another story. You all know who Sojourner Truth was, right? Enslaved woman, born and enslaved within a few miles of here. But she gets her freedom. The last family that buys her manumutes her, and she becomes one of the best-known abolitionists of the period. But her son, Peter Van Wagenen, so enslavement in New York State, 1799, New York State passes a law of gradual manumission. You can't just free all the slaves because, you're going to free children. What are they going to do? So most of the state, all of the states, when they did free the slaves, did it gradually. So in the state of New York, theoretically, all the slaves were free by 1828. After 1828, but in fact, I've just been doing some reading. There were still some 80 slaves in 1830 still. So even that law didn't particularly work completely. But the vast majority, and New York State in the 1790s, New York City had the second largest slave population after Charleston. We New Yorkers think we were good about enslavement. We were not. But so you can imagine when you've got states that are free and states that still, embrace enslavement, what are you going to do? You're going to be free. Sell them now. Well, of course, the law said you can't do that. Peter Van Wagenen, as an 8-year-old, his master sells him illegally to, I keep getting it wrong, and the paperwork just recently was discovered in Albany, just in the last year, the court case. She actually goes, with the help of Lucas Elmendorf, goes and uses the courthouse right here in Kingston. She gets her son Peter back from enslavement. This may be the first instance of certainly in New York State, or is it? Under the Dutch, as I'm reading. A lot of people say this is one of the first times a black person went to the courts, but I'm reading a book right now on enslavement in the Dutch period, and that's not true. Under the Dutch, some of the enslaved had access to the courts. But as soon as possible, she procured him a place as she says, a tender of locks at a place called Wagondale near Greenkills. So the Greenkill comes in Wagondale. This is Creek Locks. So he got a job working on one of the locks right down the Rondout here. She says they keep her a lock, but he wouldn't have been the tender. But as I said, you had two people. If he was as big and strong as she was said to be, they said she could do the work of a man, he probably was hired to take the second side, because he would have been a lot cheaper than a second man at $30 or $40 a month. So once again, here's a black person clearly employed at the earliest period, 1828. The canal is barely opened. And actually, it was opened in 1827 from Port Jervis to here, so they were operating at that point in time. But it's not all sad. Well, actually, unfortunately, Peter goes into the maritime trades and dies at sea in the 1830s. So is it in the 18? Yeah, so he died very young too. I was hoping he went on to work on the D&H Canal, and I did some research, and no, oh well. Because it's hard to get stories of people that history ignores. And women, it's even worse. I can tell you the least about women. That's going to be the hardest one. I haven't finished that presentation yet. But this is some good news. Here in 1880, the leading craft, so they're talking about, this is only June, so they've been open April, May, June. They're maybe halfway, not even halfway through the season. Some boats are making their 7th trip, and the leading craft is the H.B. Holmes with Tony Gallagher, colored captain. We wouldn't know if they, unless they put, well, as we'll see, sometimes there's other ways that we know. But here's a guy, boy, he's made 7 trips. He could do 14, 15, 16 trips, gets credited $130 per, in this, well, 1880s, he's probably, by the 1870s, they start paying you less. In the 1870s, because of a competition from railroads, they used to give you $1 a ton. It drops to 60 cents a ton. They still turn away hundreds of workers. So there are still people who need this low-paid job. It's at this point that I believe family groups start to predominate, as we'll see in a later slide. But let's hear it for H.B. Holmes, or for Tony Gallagher. Here's a captain who's working hard, and so he's making more money. I don't know. Well, let's see. It's the H.B. Holmes. So whoever's boat it was, they weren't buying it anymore. They owned it. It had numbers because the canal company owned it. When the canal company, when you owned it outright, then you gave it a name. He may have been hired by somebody, or it could have been his boat. I don't have any more. There's a research project for a history intern. Chase down Tony Gallagher. That's not a lot to go on. We don't know where he lived. We don't know. We just know he was a canal boat captain. I get a lot of it. We'll get a few more of them. The court testimony. It's a lot of boring court testimony, but there are some things like this. This is 18. I don't put the year in here. I think this is in 1854, 1855. There's a guy by the name of Peter Yapple. He's the constable in the town of Rochester, not the one on the Erie, the one just down the next town down from High Falls, from Marbletown. He had a side hustle. He owned multiple boats, and then he hired crews. So here's, instead of it being an owner-owned, the canal company actually preferred when the guy owned it because they took better care of him, whereas in these instances. But Peter Yapple owned multiple boats, and he'd hire crews. So James Rose supplies an all-black crew for $33 a month. The white captain wanted $40. So do the math. He's paid significantly less. But it becomes an opportunity, however sad. And so clearly, Peter Yapple, he didn't decide to pay the extra $7 to Captain Hornbeck. This is interesting because it's the only painting of a person of color. This is an E.L. Henry painting. This is in the Village of Ellenville offices. I know Mike, the town manager, so I got to take Sanderson had a really horrible picture of it, so I got to take a wonderful color picture. E.L. Henry's a great painter. But this is of Fred Thomas, Black Fred. And as it says on the back, probably in E.L.'s handwriting, a hunchback canal boatman and a guide of the trout streams was murdered by another Negro some years ago. That man's name was David Depew, because this altercation makes the New York Times. But what a wonderful painting. So we know a little bit about Fred Thomas. I only have the names of, I think it's 20 some odd black canalers. I have 1,600 names, but I can only say definitively that 20 of them are people of color. So this is a story that a guy by the name of Earl Mack worked on the canal and creek locks. So the coal company sells the canal 1898. They get out of it. They're a railroad now. The canal isn't making money for them. The Cornell company, Kirkendall, buys the canal for $10,000. Cost $2 million with the gravity railroad to build. Cost at least $2 million in the final enlargement. Sells the entire thing for $10,000. He operates it for a couple years, but then it becomes for the cement industry until 1917. And now they're bringing coal in from the Hudson River, and it just runs to High Falls and back. And so in this period, here's a story. Earl Mack this is in the 1960s. It's an oral history collected by my organization in our earliest period. And he talks about Jim Schoonmaker, who's running one of the boats. He runs a coal boat. So he's running coal to the various cement concerns still operating in Rosendale. He was known as a really great chef. So Earl and his dad, they come across Jim's boat on the side of the canal there, somewhere in Rosendale. They smell the corned beef and cabbage. They go in, they eat his entire meal. And they see him coming and they run off. And according to this, they were out of sight before Jim reached the boat and discovered his loss. Next time they met Jim, they had a good laugh about it, including Jim, for after all, it was another acknowledgement of his prowess at the cook stove. Really? Do you believe that? Because I don't. This is racism. Do you think if this was a white guy, they would have eaten the entire thing? Do you think if this was a white guy, they would have run off without telling him, hey, we had some of your dinner? And do you think Jim really had a good laugh about it? I don't think so. And yet this is 1968, and this is somebody telling this story. So we've come a long way, but as we've learned recently, not far enough. And here's another data point. I at one point thought that was in a newspaper. That would have been even worse. But it's bad enough anybody telling that story and thinking that, thinking he was okay with it, really? Yeah, he smiled because he had no choice, right? Wonderful painting. We just had a third one donated. We have 3 paintings. William Rickerby Miller was a Brit who came to America. They call him a Hudson River School painter. By my lights, he's more a genre painter, more in the mold of E.L. Henry, less of that romanticized nature and more like a photograph. We have now 3 of them. But this is an 1865 watercolor. Let's see, the Canal House is right there. I didn't point that out on that slide with Sojourner Truth, but that building was our home where the museum is, the Depew Tavern in High Falls. I should have, but that's the Depew Tavern. This is looking south. For those of you, that's where Skytop is. This used to be my opening slide when I did presentations at Mohawk Mountain House. All the guests were like, oh, but this is the reason this is on here. These were referred to as, well, I won't say what, the N-word locks. So these locks were my supposition is that at some point in time, the people that were working them were people of color. That side of High Falls, all the activity, and High Falls was a booming town in the 1870s. But over here, there was nothing over here. There's a steep cliff. This was kind of the wrong side of the tracks, so they make it the wrong side of the creek. And so I think at some period, people of color, and that's how they got the name. The names of lock tenders I have for those locks are white, but that doesn't cover the entire period. So again, it's hard to, how do you figure out, at some point I need to go through a lot of censuses. I need to, I got my work cut out for me. I got to live another 65 years. But a beautiful painting, and we have 2 on display, and one I'm just waiting. It was just been donated when I get a third one, a beautiful nighttime scene of a lock and a stone house, very romanticized, but it's the Canal House. But apparently, nighttime scenes are fantastic fantasies. But that'll go on display once we get all the paperwork. So if you like the painter, we'll have 3 really great. We also have 3 paintings by Lee Grand Botsford, and I'll get to Lee Grand in a minute, who is a folk artist who worked for E.L. Henry, and we have 3 of his paintings on display too. That one is it's at the visitor center. It's 18 by 14. It's yeah. About the size of this podium, if I upended it. Yeah. So let's see. We've talked about immigrants. We've talked about people of color. Now we'll get to women. So here in Alpheus Galway, one of the so his wife was clearly worked along with him, and she would cook and tend to the things in the boat, which had to be done, cleaning, etc., steering the boat. Occasionally dispel us when we're required, and watching the boat when we're lying still. So here was somebody that probably, and I have a lot of, these are interesting because there you go. Well, and so 1870s, now they're paying you less. It's my contention at this point it becomes more subsistence. I think we see more families, now you don't have to pay anybody. So you're paying a child, usually a mule driver, $9 a month. You're paying a captain, well, you saw $40 was what a whole crew was going to cost you. So that's the captain, the bowman, and the mule driver. The mule driver is down at 8, so now you got another 40, you got 20, do the math. Instead of paying individuals now, families would just come and the children. And so there's 2 different stories on this particular. There's the story of the family. So this is in fact, it's right over there. This is the little Freddie. These are the Camerons, and this is George, Maddie, and Fred. And so I speculate that they may have named Fred Fred is certainly one of their children, maybe their firstborn, maybe not. But I wonder if the little Freddie wasn't named for Fred, for one of their children. But the other interesting thing is I've now found, so we have 6 or 8 photos like this. We have, I haven't counted, but I've got 6 or 8 taken in this same spot. So this is the Laco accident. This is one of John Roebling. He built 4 suspension aqueducts for the D&H Canal Company between 47 and 50. That's 1847, 1850. I've got 6 or 8 all taken here. So I think a photographer, when he had nothing better to do, would set up. So the aqueducts, all the locks, most of the aqueducts, some of them were two-way, but most of them, they were all single file. And so you had to wait. So here's a boat waiting for a boat coming this way, photo op. But the other thing here is, here's the DeGroot family. This was a donation from the great, let's see, I guess this is his grandfather. He's got a great story. The railroads spooked the team, and little Ralph here held on for dear life and finally got the team in. He got 4 cents from his father for that. And it's funny because when I heard the story, they told me it was a nickel, and then he sent me somebody had typed it out. It's funny how we round up. But, imagine 4 whole cents, right? But the other, so the two, lots of family groups now. So you buy a boat, you live on the boat yourself, your kids work, dad, and all of these pictures, it's always, I'm told that they had to lean against, because the pull of the boat, to lean against the tiller. But still, I think women steered, men had to sit up and push off and keep things safe, and then the children. But I think in the latter probably 20 years, it was subsistence activity by family groups like this. But I also just love the idea of the photographic opportunity too. There's one spot where Dorothy Sanderson she must have gotten her cards mixed up. Remember before computers? Because this is from a footnote in Dorothy Sanderson's very excellent, it was in that slide of my sources. But I cannot find this story in the one that she cited. So I think that she must have used like little recipe cards kind of thing, and she must have confused them. But I still believe in Dorothy, and she reported that a woman was discovered on a D&H Canal boat dressed as a man to get work. So here are women, they're not getting paid well. So, and this has been documented, Peter, there's a book called Common Labor about the building of canals, and he talks about women that would dress as men to get work in quarries, if you can believe it. I'd take work on a canal boat over quarry work any day. I don't know about the rest of you. And actually now this is the same image as over there. So it is the same one now. That's right there in Creek Locks. So as I said already, I got ahead of myself. Families ran most of the boats in the latter period because it had gone down 40%. The canal company, these were hard-nosed capitalists. It made money until it didn't. It's not like they let that thing suck. They closed when they had to close, But they paid you less. But as I say, they had more workers than they needed. So there was a need. There were people that needed this lower paying work. It's sad that the things that you make the papers for. Catherine Ann Skepmos was a colored cook on canal boat number 579, a severe accident. This is in 1870. She low bridge. She didn't. Nobody warned her, and she damaged her. No further information. Her head was caught between it and the boat, and one side of her head was terribly lacerated. She lives in Greenkill, so once again, just down a mile or two that away, the Greenkill comes out of Whiteport and hits the roundout down just in Creek Locks, where she now lies in critical situation. There's another one where it would be nice to see if we could find out anything more about. So, for instance, in this story, the strange sinking of a canal boat, a coal boat taking coal to Sing Sing. There's probably a great story, and they're joking that somehow, right? A boat sinks. This is in the New York Times. Large hole in its side. They find there's nobody on it when they finally retrieve the boat, but there's women's clothing and stuff. Well, they find out that the boat was in the name of a Bertha, where it is in there, Bertha Schroeder of Honesdale. And I find in a later newspaper account that she was fine. So here's one story where I've got a little closure. But here was a woman that owned the boat. There's instances in the court cases where it sounds like women would buy boats, would be in their names, so dad owed some money, so the boat was in mom's name, that kind of thing. But in this instance, it would appear that she owned the boat and ran the boat because she was on it when it sank. But all was well. Nobody got hurt. I don't know. They don't say what happened to the boat itself, whether it was salvageable. And here's a typical. So William Franz, he's a mule driver, a hoagie at age 7. Age 16, he's the captain already. This is his 12-year-old brother. So his 12-year-old brother's a bowman. He's the captain steering, and then they've got another 6 or 7-year-old. And as William Franz tells us, the crews of the small boats were made up more of boys and half-brother persons. If he's referring to small boats, this is previous to 1850, when the boats were 70 foot by 9 foot, carried 30, then 80, then 50, then 80 tons of coal. So this, even in the 1840s, these boats are being run by children. I do a presentation on child labor, and I've got to say, it's not right to call them children. You know, childhood for most people, for anybody but the rich people, is a 20th century invention. People had large families. There were multiple epidemics. Child mortality was high. You had a large family to have workers. Why was school in the winter? Because that's when you could spare the kids, because otherwise you needed them. You know, you grew up quick in that era. And this is just two of them. Here's James McHugh. He's a driver at the age 10, captain at 13. And so typically he's the oldest person on the boat. Now, he was driving for his father, but still, so his father either owned multiple boats or tended the farm and sent the kids out on the canal boat. Imagine a 13-year-old in charge of, and then he has a boy to drive the boat. He doesn't even pay him. He just keeps him through the winter. There's a lot of that. There's an oft-told story on the D&H Canal that so a mule in 1855, a good mule, $100 at the beginning of the season, 50 at the end of the season, supply and demand. You had to you know, keep them through the winter and couldn't make money off them. So you had $200 of horse flesh, and very often the mule drivers, they would get kids from orphanages. They'd pay the poorhouse. Sometimes they'd just give the kids room and board if. Sometimes they'd hire them on and then not pay them. But there's an oft-told story that, according to the lore, claims that if a team fell in, you rescue the mules first, because you can always get another orphan. I cannot find any primary source documentation of this story. My line is, it depends on the kid, right? You know, some kids not so much, others, rescue them, you know. But he also talks about, and again, through this testimony that they talk about black hands. That, you know, it's clear that there was a lot of this population, and you get your data points where you get them, don't you? You know, this is an actual page of the printed testimony there on the left. I hope this was just a photo op, but who knows? That's an awful young mule driver there. You know, and with family groups, you might have, you know, a younger child who wants to do with the older child. You don't know. You know, we can tell. I can make up stories all day long, but I won't. I'm a historian. This is a fairly long story that I'll encapsulate because it's just kind of interesting and sort of the kinds of things that happened back then. Family loses a son out berry picking, and they go looking far and wide to find young, I think his name is Gary Hart, is it? Oh, Henry Hart. Henry Hart. They never find him. They give him up for dead. They have another child. They name him Henry, which really kind of cruel when you think about it. But happened often if you lost a child. So they assumed that he died. So this is how many years? 9 years. 9 years later, this guy is this young man, this Henry Hart. A guy goes, "Are you a Hart?" And he goes, I might be. And to make the long story shorter, he goes and he meets his family. His mother immediately recognizes him, but he gets lost. He gets absconded by a man who he thought was his father, who basically slave labor, claimed it. You know, so he was kidnapped. For 9 years, the man with whom he lived and who he supposed was his father boated on the Delaware and Hudson Canal, and he vividly recollects how the brute of a man locked him up in the barn, flogging him and half starving him at times. After 9 years of such treatment, he ran away and fared better. This story has a happy ending because he found his family. But can you imagine? You know, you get lost in the woods and I found a lot of stories of boys running off to work on the canal. But no, exactly. And imagine, you know, so here you are. You're in the middle of nowhere. You're working your butt off on Dad's farm. Maybe it's a life. And then a canal boat comes by, and the whole world, just the possibility. Why wouldn't you run off to work on a canal boat? You know, but many. And I love this image. This once again, this is after 1895 because there's the Ulster and Delaware Railroad, which doesn't get extended. This is once again right here in Rondout. You know, I didn't deliberately put a lot of Rondout pictures in here, but it did work out. I've reworked this talk a lot. It's a popular one, but I always target them a little bit. Another sad story. This is a twofer because it's an immigrant boy, a young German boy named Myers is sick working, and so he just dumps him under a bridge, just leaves him there. He winds up in the poorhouse. The boy now lies in critical condition. Another story that we don't even have a name. So, well, we do, Myers. Um, and they know the name of the captain. It makes you wonder if he ever had any. Did they ever get even with Captain Campbell? What, you know. But not only did children work on the boats, these are stonecutters in Allergerville, in St. Joseph is the name of the stone-cutting area, made millstones. They were marketed right here around out as Esopus stones, and they were said to be as good as the French millstones. But look at the ages of these guys. We have the names of all these gentlemen, too. I know all their names. I've got it. You know, you had Coopers. Coopering, fascinating topic. We'll have somebody presenting on Coopering in our lecture series. We're Friday nights, so it's all good. Fascinating. Been around since the Egyptian time. Any person can take 300-400 pounds because of the shape of a barrel. You can roll it. An amazing, you know, Coopers were ubiquitous in American history. They made every town had a Cooper. They made your wash buckets. They made your sap buckets. They made your firkins for butter. They didn't just make barrels, but with the cement industry, you had Whiteport, they were making 1,000 barrels of cement a day and 800 barrels. So just imagine, eventually in Whiteport, they actually recooper. They don't even, it makes me think of Charles Chips. Anybody old enough to remember? You know, they wouldn't make barrels anymore. You'd send back the barrels and they'd fix them and put more cement in them. But again, look at the ages. There's 3 or 4, 11, 12-year-olds. But this was typical. The first time I saw this picture, I said, this is just a photo op. They're in their Sunday best. But a cement historian friend of mine said, no, they liked having children. When you had to set a charge, you could get children into those little crevices and stuff better. So they had and again, look at all the children there. But now here in 1858 already, they often substitute women and girls for men and boys. We often find them the best boatmen. You know, I always notice with the women at the tiller, that takes more brains, right? Leave the lady there. Let the guys do the, So even in that early period, and here now in the latter period, 1895, boating is very poor on the canal, and many little girls are seen driving the teams, their service being much more cheaply obtained than that of men or boys. So, do I have names? I have the names of 3 women mule drivers, and 2 of them is their married names, which is to say I don't really have their names. Fortunately, because of this, because you have a recording of her, we have a statue in front of the museum of a mule and a girl mule driver, and we have a video. Catherine Huftel, she's a mule driver for her father's boat in the 1890s. She marries an Erie Canal boatman by the name of Huftel. And in 1956, they're interviewing him. And so the very offensive, chauvinistic historian interviewing them spends a half hour with her. But we have our own words. It's wonderful. It's great to have. And through social media, so through the Maritime Museum, Sarah Johnson, we put it up on, we were trying to find Mrs. Patrick Fitzgerald. How many Patty Fitzgeralds, I suppose, were running around, right? So we put it up on social media, on Facebook, and Sarah says, we've got a recording. And so we've now, we're in contact with some of the relatives. I want a picture. Get me a picture. Oh, I'd love to get a picture of her. This is interesting because this was, until recently, the only contemporary image of a girl mule driver on the D&H Canal, even though there were hundreds, if not thousands, but certainly hundreds. This is E.L. Henry's very famous On the Towpath. We were offered this painting for $350,000 in the 1990s. Needless to say, we didn't have $350,000. But until recently, the only contemporary image of a girl mule driver. But it gets better. About a year ago, the Cragsmore Free Library got 130 black and white glass negatives taken by Lee Grand Botsford. Lee Grand was the hermit of Cragsmore, which is weird because he ran a tavern. But then I think maybe it's like the quiet Bill Merchant. Maybe it's tongue-in-cheek. Maybe he was really, really outgoing. But he was a folk artist. He took photographs for E.L. Henry, and E.L. Henry taught him to paint. And if you come to the museum, we've got 3 of his paintings on display. They're very folk arty. They're wonderful in their way. But this, out of these 130, I went to the opening. I didn't know what I was going to see, but I knew Lee Grand, and I was curious, But what do I see? But there on the left, let's see. That's the painting. That's the photograph. I see the photograph. I go, Bayat, who's the curator, I said, this has got to be a photograph of the painting. He goes, well, it says canal scene on the paper. It didn't say on the towpath. So we put them side by side, and if you look at them carefully enough, so this is even more exciting because now this is an actual girl, an actual boat, an actual place. There's not many places in Ellenville where you'll see buildings on that side. That's the Shawangum Ridge there. This has probably all been blown away by the golf course. It's just south of Ellenville. But, and if the boat, it might be easier, let me see, go back one for a minute. Well, you can't see it on there very well either. There's a steer's head on the front of the boat. So they would do, I have another image of a boat that's got a cutout of a bobby, an English policeman on it. Like, what is that? Nobody has been able to I'm very excited to know this is an actual person, an actual boat, an actual place. But the story does get better. We're working on a video project with the Ellenville Library, and Courtney Conti, who's a video editor, assistant curator, and she's in charge of our visitor center. We're looking through their books of D&H pictures. Everybody's got books of D&H pictures, right? And what does she see but what is the second known image of a girl mule driver? And nothing against the wonderful people at the Ellenville Library. They didn't know what they had. They didn't realize it was rare. So, the beat goes on. You keep trying to do research just to learn. I see other pictures of boys, and you go, well, maybe it's a girl dressed like a boy. But I think it's unlikely. I think that women dress like, this is, before the 1960s. Women dressed like women. I think that this is a very rare photograph. We'll keep looking. You never know what you're going to find. So my conclusions, the D&H Canal relied largely on an immigrant workforce to build the canal. It employed immigrants and blacks almost exclusively to operate. Certainly, management jobs were higher up, were older white men. There are some stories of immigrants that did better. James Archibald becomes an engineer, an Irish immigrant. But it couldn't have been built or run without immigrant labor, I can say definitively. Women regularly worked on the canal, often with their families, but I can tell you the least. That's why it's the challenge of doing, I'm dying to see what I do when I do women on the D&H Canal. It's going to be just trying to find images. Well, I'll work it out somehow, folks. And children as young as 7 and even earlier, as we saw, regularly employed on the D&H Canal, both boys and girls. So if you enjoyed this at all, I wrote a whole article, some 12,000 words, imagine. Me, 12,000 words? And it was the autumn 2021, which is still available, but I also have it, if anybody's interested, I have it in a PDF form. And a lot of the stories that are in here and more, because you can only, especially trying to do all of the marginalized. I actually do a presentation just on the black experience. I do one on child labor. I do one on immigrants. And that's why I'm finally getting to you girls. 2023, the year I do, I had one more slide there and I blacked it out by mistake. How do I undo that? Do I, or? Back might. There we go. Not that I really needed it, but so thank you very much for having me. And if anybody's got questions, I can take them now. I covered it that well. You're very welcome. Yep.
We don't have any questions on our end.
Yeah.
I have questions. Can I remember it now?
Oh, you should have interrupted me, but that's hard to do, right?
Oh, I'm pretty good. You explained the painting. Look up to me. I will not wake you up in the middle of the night to tell you.
No, here's I'll give you an email so you don't call me. Any other?
There's a lot of connections going on between what's happening with the canal, right? It's economics. What's happening with the railroad, right? And what it's doing to the people who are being employed by the canal. So that it looks like as the economic situation is changing for the canal, so are the people who are actually working on the canal. Is that true?
So That's a tough question to try and summarize. Well, I think it's true of any endeavor that they affect one another. The people start work. Think about what happened with the railroads. Eventually, the Pullman cars come out, and that this becomes an opportunity for black men. Black men were the Pullman porters. This is a later period. So you get these waves of immigration too. So the Irish. Everybody asks me, were the Italians working on the canal? No, that's later. Italian immigration doesn't, and I'm not sure what drove the Italians here, but it doesn't happen until the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. You get Eastern Europeans. So you look at the Ashokan Reservoir being built in the 1900s. Now this is black and Italian workers, because those are the people who now are taking the low-level jobs. The Irish have come in, they've been assimilated, they've gone to our schools. Think about people from Eastern Europe. The Roebling Museum is down in Roebling, New Jersey, and the story they celebrate is the Eastern European workers that came at the turn of the 20th century and worked at what was basically a metal. Carnegie was buying up all the steel plants. He wasn't going to sell to Roeblings. Roeblings didn't want any of that. John Roebling was one of the richest men in America because of wire rope, but he moved his works to Trenton, New Jersey, because Peter Cooper had a wire factory there so that he could get the raw materials. Carnegie was going to take over, and we see this. It happens time and time again with industries. They consolidate. Somebody wants to take the entire thing. It's what happened with the cement industry. Carnegie was cutting everybody out. Roebling wasn't going to go under Carnegie's thumb, so he started a recycling operation. The town of Roebling, New Jersey, was recycling metal so they could continue making wire rope without giving money to Carnegie, to Andrew Carnegie. And so you see that the way these histories develop. There's a need, there's a spot. But what's fascinating here is here's a job in America in the 19th century that it's all marginalized. The canal could not have, I don't know what I would have thought when I went into it, but I walk out of it going, this thing wouldn't have existed without immigrants. And I think we're to that point today still. I think it's as I cited the restaurant workers and agricultural workers. Studies have been done. Immigrants are nothing but a net positive. You hear stories. We politicize it, but the fact is we need them, and we are a country of immigrants. Unless you're like me and have a little Indian blood, a little native blood, I'm very proud of that 32nd of my heritage. We're all interlopers. We destroyed an amazing culture. That wasn't their primary aim, but that's what happened. This is history. This is how things move along. Maybe that's why I find history so fascinating, is to watch the arc of it and a lot of the immigration, so of the Napoleonic Wars, the Irish famine, all these things, that's why John Roebling came here, because of the Napoleonic Wars. He gets out of Mulhausen and comes here. And what does he do? He makes good. He becomes one of the wealthiest men in America. But that's a whole nother talk. I do that one too, actually. Well, I've got a problem with that. But the fascinating thing is, here it is, 1825. There's already jobs we think are beneath us. There's something really American about that too, I guess. So sad but true. Well, the Muncie and Lenape, whose land we're on. my Seneca great-great-grandmother. That's those were the Americans. They had an amazing culture. They didn't have the wheel, except for children's toys. But they had, if you read 1491 by Charles Mann, it's all about what we now know about the Americas. The Amazon was being totally managed by the native peoples. So they were encouraging cashew, they were encouraging plants they want and getting rid of, poison ivy, whatever. There's a story. There's a Spanish monk. He's traveling down the Amazon. He's passing town. There was millions of people. There was viable cultures here, but they just developed differently because they were so far apart. Think about how China developed separately from Europe. Well, they had a much. They talk about Indian givers. Native Americans didn't believe you could own land. That's hubris. The land it's Mother Earth. It's how we all live. How could you own that? How could you think you own that? They had a whole different mindset. We call them Indian givers. They looked at us. They thought we were making rental agreements. Yeah, you can use that field too. The Americans said, yeah, now get out. I often wonder what we would have been like if the Europeans didn't have guns. You know, what if the culture that was here had transplanted itself? What if people saw the world the way the native people did? You know, we'll never know. Yeah. Oh, well, some people say they did. The syphilis, they go back and forth on that one. You know, but yeah. Well, that would be a little poetic justice, at least, right? Yeah.
I know there's D&H Railroad. When did the company just morph from being a canal company into being a railroad company, or?
They did it very gradually. So, you know, I'm working on the National Register listing of the D&H Canal, working with two excellent historians for the contractor, but I was the guy with the D&H knowledge. And they, in their heads, just said, so when did they just turn it into a railroad? And I said, no, that's not what happened. They ran the first steam locomotive in the Western Hemisphere, the Starbridge Lion, albeit for 2 test runs. It was too heavy for the tracks. It's my contention, I like to say, the Starbridge Lion was made in Starbridge, England. So it's 1829. England is at the forefront. Now, you'd had railroads, they're pulling mules. Now they're going to use steam technology to, oh, now it's going back. They're going to use steam technology. I was going to try and find you that slide, but they're going to use steam technology instead of animal power. Prior to that, it was animal power pulling them. So they're at the forefront. These are $3,500, $4,000 machines at this point, an immense amount of money. Horatio Allen's a young engineer. He's already quit the canal company because he knows railroads are the common thing. So he's going over to England to study railroads. A lot of people did that. Canal engineers, we didn't have civil engineering schools yet. You'd go where the action was and learn. So Horatio Allen's there. So they have him arranged to buy 4 steam locomotives. One of them is the Starbridge Lion. The other was the Pride of Newcastle, renamed the America. It's my contention those are the only 2 that came over, but I've still got to chase that down. I like to say the Starbridge Lion was 5 tons in Starbridge, England, but it was 7 tons in Honesdale. John Jervis had designed the gravity railroad to carry 5 tons burden, but they get it on the tracks and it's too heavy. Now, why do you think that might be? The imperial system. The British system, and I've done the research, they've changed since that era, but 5 imperial tons in 1829 were 7 American tons. Interestingly enough, John Roebling, in all of his correspondence, when he says a ton, in parentheses, he says how many pounds he means. So being a European, he was aware of the difference. It's my contention that's why the Starbridge Lion was too heavy. I've heard a lot of hogwash. I've heard stories that don't make any sense. This holds water, unless you say, oh, come on. The space program has 2 instances of the same thing. The Hubble Space Telescope went up in the air with some component made to the wrong measurement. They had to send a whole space shuttle up to fix it, to replace it. And one of the Mars landers was calculated distance the wrong one, and so it shut off before it landed. And it was because of a mix-up between metric and American measurements. So that's my, it's now in print because I told Stephen Blauweiss, and in his excellent book on Kingston, his D&H section, he puts that out there. But prior to that, I didn't get my book out quick enough. I was going to be the first one. That's all right. Knowledge is knowledge. But that you know. So the railroad, to really answer your question, so they've got the gravity railroad, first gravity railroad in America, an innovation in and of itself. By 1860, they're doing passenger traffic on their gravity railroad. That becomes a whole thing. It becomes a passenger thing. Farview at the top of the Moosic Mountain becomes a destination. They start buying railroads and leasing railroads. By 1872, coincidentally, the year that they moved the most coal on their canal, almost 1.5 million tons, they own or control rail lines from New York City to Montreal. Smart of them. Canada, it's cold up there. They really need the coal. Railroads, that's the way to move coal in the winter. So they're on a dual path. They're a coal company. The canal was just the means to an end. That was the best way to get the coal out of the middle of nowhere to somewhere where they could get, they got some of their coal to Pennsylvania, but there was closer coal. They couldn't be competitive, so they went to New York and were massively successful. Some people say, and I've got to chase this down, that the D&H Canal Company was one of the most successful companies in the 19th century in its era as well. Interestingly enough, too, all of the major railroads were stock schemes. All the early British canal stuff were money schemes. They weren't really about the canals. They were about making money. And all of the major railroad schemes, none of this was for the public good. They were money-making schemes. If you know about the Transcontinental Railroad, the Credit Mobilier, you know, it was all about rich men making more money. The incidental thing was coal got someplace, railroads got built, and the D&H was a part of it as well. I got done reading a book about the robber barons of the late 19th century and was astounded because they were all dirty. I don't know why I was astounded. It's kind of like realizing women were the most marginalized. Why was I surprised? You know, you didn't get the vote until a half century after black men, right? I mean, you know, a data point as to, you know, where do you fall in the, you know. So we're trying to correct history. I have a real problem, too, when people want to talk about woke. I'm doing a lot of research on enslavement. My building had 5 enslaved, and there'll be a sign up. I'm still wrapping my brain around the best way to do it. But this isn't being woke. This isn't being elitist. This is trying to be accurate. You know, Thomas Jefferson was a farmer. That man never got his hand in dirt. He owned up to 180 individuals. And so you're not telling the true story unless you go and you scratch out these stories of the people who actually, boots in the ground, did the work. If we don't talk about enslavement, we're not talking about how America was built. We were built on the back of slaves. The Civil War was predetermined. It was predestined. When you say all men are equal, but say some of them are only, 3/5, 2/5 of a human being, there's a cognitive dissonance there. There's a problem here. And it took a war. It took the major event in American history in some ways to still not completely settle it, as we've all learned in more recent history. You're very welcome. My pleasure.
I just want to go on the tape for a second, please. So that's all the time we have. If anyone has any additional questions that you think of when you leave, you can email education@hrmm.org, and I will forward them along to you. Please visit the D&H Canal Museum, and thank you for coming here tonight. Our next lecture is February 8th at 7 p.m., and it will be in person. We'll hopefully be back in the Wooden Boat School, and also available on Zoom. So thank you very much. I'm glad you came out tonight. Thank you, Bill.